And thank you all for joining today. This is the part one of a special two-part series, hearing from the leaders of the practice group Inclusion Champions on how they leverage their power and influence to create inclusive cultures within their practice group. My name is Layla Hawk. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Diversity Lab. And I have been in the weeds on the inclusion blueprint from start to finish. I didn't begin working on it in 2018 when it started, but it feels like it's been about that long, so shortly thereafter. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and our moderator today before just an introduction of why we're all here, and then we'll get into the meat of the subject. So today we're joined by Gina Passarella, the editor-in-chief of The American Lawyer. She's also moderator extraordinaire, so we're really happy to have her here leading this esteemed panel. And our panelists today are Sid Bale. He's the vice chair of the Global Corporate Practice Group at Reed Smith. We have Dion Bregman, who's the deputy practice group leader for IP at Morgan Lewis. And Keith Garner, who's the practice group leader of the Real Estate, Land Use, Natural Resources, and Environmental Practice Group at Sheppard Mullin. I know we're still hoping that Kyle Faget will join, if possible. And if she does, we'll let her just step right in as appropriate. So why are we here and why are we hearing from these practice group leaders? These practice group leaders really stood out from the 2022 Inclusion Blueprint. The Inclusion Blueprint is a partnership between Diversity Lab and CHIPS. We piloted the Inclusion Blueprint beginning in 2018 as a way to measure inclusion, gender inclusion, for lawyers within the IP practice groups. Since then, we've expanded it to include LGBTQ plus lawyers, lawyers with disabilities, and underrepresented racial and ethnic lawyers. And we've invited practice groups beyond IP to complete the assessment. In 2022, we had more than 240 law firms submit the Inclusion Blueprint and 175 individual practice group submissions. From those 175 practice group submissions, we identified 13 practice group inclusion champions, and you can find those on our website, which I'll put in the chat once I'm not talking. And these leaders are the practice group leaders here today lead some of those practice groups. And then our part two of this program will be on Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern, that's 9 a.m. Pacific. We'll be joined by a new group of practice group leaders to talk about some of these practices. So what made these practice group leaders stand out? We had a minimum threshold for what it took to achieve to be named inclusion champions. That was scoring at least 70% out of 100 on the practice group assessment, with an average score of about 50 across all of the practice group assessments. At 70% really was quite high and quite challenging. They all also committed to do something hard at the practice group level. The Do Something Hard is a challenge that Diversity Lab put out to the legal industry in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. And we've seen a lot of practice groups and law firms pick up those practices, and we're excited that it's continued really with more, I think, steam than we anticipated. Also, the practice groups in the law firms indicated that they were either meeting average or above average thresholds, or indicated year-over-year diversity progress for each of the 4 underrepresented populations that were assessed by the Inclusion Blueprint. So that's women, LGBTQ plus lawyers, lawyers with disabilities, and underrepresented racial and ethnic lawyers. That's important because we want to make sure that none of the champions were really excelling in inclusion for one underrepresented population to the exclusion of others. And on that note, outside of just those minimum thresholds, which are quite high, I think, we really saw that the practice group leaders here, and that we'll hear from on Thursday, excelled in some specific practices throughout the Inclusion Blueprint. So when our data and analyst team kind of looked at everything, we saw about 8 practices that the practice group leaders, that these practice groups were doing at a much higher rate than the non-champions. We're going to get into the meat of some of those practices today and hear from the practice group leaders on exactly how they're driving those practices forward. But just 2 that I wanted to mention before we dive in, because they're important in a way to sort of indicate an inclusive culture. And we saw it at both the firm leadership and at the practice group level. The first is all of the practice group champions include lawyers with disabilities in their DEI efforts. It's immensely important because when we look at the Inclusion Blueprint results, which we'll be releasing later this month, we see that that population is consistently the least checked box when we look at how law firms are tracking opportunities for lawyers with disabilities. So the inclusion champions include them in all of their efforts. They make sure they're tracking and monitoring opportunities for lawyers with disabilities and making sure that this important underrepresented population has just equal access as the other underrepresented populations. We also see that the practice groups and the firm leadership champions track intersectional identities when they are looking at opportunities within the firm. So they understand that these layered social identities have a real impact on an individual's experience. And rather than just look at each underrepresented population within a monolith, they look at the human below those intersectional identities to see if they can uncover any other institutional biases that don't show up in just sort of one underrepresented population. So we're really excited to have the practice groups here to talk about sort of how those high-level policies really permeate through their actions on a day-to-day basis as practice group leaders. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Gina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Layla, and to Diversity Lab for all of the work that you do in this space to help keep us all thinking about these issues and being intentional and doing hard things. And I think the group of speakers that we have today show that when you do hard things, it makes a difference and you get results. And so that's why I love this conversation, because I think we're really going to dive into what specifically did you do? What can we all leave this conversation with and go back and think about in our own organizations and really get into some practical guidance? And as Layla mentioned, there are several different characteristics of some of the champions that the Diversity Lab highlighted. We're going to talk about 4 main ones today, but I do just want to set the tone that this conversation is for all of you. So if there's something that you're thinking about or wondering and want to hear about, throw a question into the chat, raise your hand. You can just ask it. This is just a conversation. We want it to be as useful to all of you as possible. And I'll just say that while we've heard from other of these webinars that have focused more on the law firm leadership at the macro level, there's no doubt that leadership at the top needs to set the tone on these issues. The overall firm culture can definitely have an impact. But I love this focus on practice group leaders. And I think it's really timely too, because we've just seen there's no doubt that practice group leaders particularly are getting more and more power within the firm. They're charged with really overseeing the P&Ls of their organizations, and they can leverage that to do really big things. And I'll just note too, we just put out at the American Lawyer a mid-level associate satisfaction survey, and I can't tell you how overwhelmingly that critical piece of your talent pool would highlight the individual partners that they work with, the practice areas that they work with could have a very meaningful difference in their experience at a firm. So talent is paying attention to these issues, and that transparency and the opportunities they get really are impacted at the practice and partner level. So I think this is really important to be talking about on these issues. So let's dive right into one of the first topics, which is equal access to sponsorships, relationships, activities. How are we making sure that everyone in your practice group has the ability to, and the sense of belonging, frankly, to take advantage of different opportunities, and how are you tracking that to ensure that it is happening at an equal level? So Dion, maybe we can start with you, and we'll
Sure. So I'll maybe preface this a little bit by saying that I'm the deputy practice group leader of the intellectual property group here at Morgan Lewis, and IP has some unique challenges compared to some other practices. Specifically, about half of our attorneys have to have technical backgrounds. So they either have to have engineering backgrounds or scientific backgrounds. So that greatly impacts the pool of candidates that we're able to recruit, either directly from law school, actually in some instances directly from engineering or science programs, or laterally. On top of that, the US has really been moving in a direction where the types of engineering and sciences that the US participates in the most, electrical engineering, computer science, and biotechnology. And so now we've got an even smaller pool. It's not just any engineer or any scientist. It's now an even smaller subsection. And when you look at life sciences, really we're talking about PhDs. So you've got to have an advanced degree as well. So our pool of candidates is a lot smaller, and it makes those candidates so much more valuable, both within the firm and ensuring that you retain the associates, patent agents, technical specialists that we have. So I'll tell you a little bit about what Morgan Lewis does on the sponsorship side, and I'm pretty proud of what we do within the practice group. So on the firm level, we have a sponsorship program that if you are a diverse attorney and you are 5th year and above, you will get assigned someone from what we call our advisory board, or it's our board of directors. Maybe there are 20 people on the advisory board, to very high level management to help mentor you and ensure that you have the opportunities that others are being exposed to, and maybe even more so. But on the practice group level, what we do is we have something called our Career Progression Initiative, which has worked incredibly well. And what we do for the Career Progression Initiative, or our CPI program, is for diverse associates, they can opt in, so it's not forced on anyone. If people want to opt in, they can. Currently we do it for African American associates and Latinx associates, and they can opt into the program. Once they're in the program, they prepare a business plan, they get assigned a team, what we call a career progression team, which includes a mentor partner, which I'm sure most firms have, but then we also include a sponsor partner. That partner's entire goal is to be the person's sponsor, may not even be in the same practice group. And then we have a practice group area leader. So the sponsor is someone generally pretty senior in the firm, a mentor that often works directly with the associates, and then the practice group leader, one of the practice group leaders, is involved. And we meet a couple of times a year. The associates prepares a business plan, and we focus on a couple of things. We focus on setting out some goals, providing feedback, whether it's formal or informal feedback, ensuring that the nature of assignments that the associates get are broad and commensurate with their level where they should be. And we look at their personal productivity, which is really how busy they are. We look at business development and client opportunities and ensure that those diverse associates are getting the business development and client opportunities, as many opportunities as possible. And then we create, at the end of every meeting, we have a whole bunch of action items that we then come back to the associates on this periodic basis. So, most associates at firms may have a business plan, but it sort of gets shelved 90% of the year, and they maybe pull it out once a year to look at it. And really the idea here is to look at it way more frequently, and not just have a mentor, but have true sponsors in the firm that can actually make a measurable difference, making introductions, ensuring that associates get in front of certain clients, etc. So I think that's been a great success so far. I'm involved with 2 different associates personally that I do this with. It's pretty time consuming, I'm not going to lie, but it really makes a difference, and the associates that participate seem to enjoy it, especially on the business development stuff, because most associates, really, the good associates, are working very hard, and they don't, just like partners, frankly, and they often don't think about business development opportunities as often as they should. And this is a way of forcing the associates to think about BD efforts. And when it comes down to it, if you're diverse associates and you're coming up for partner and you've already got a ton of client contacts, or even maybe your own work that you brought into the firm, of course, that's going to be an enormous leg up for partnership and push your career forward. So the business development side of things is incredibly important, and I think often overlooked with diverse associates. So I'll stop there for the time being.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And just I'm going to actually ask you one follow-up question, which is, do you feel like you have good uptake and usage by the associate? You said it's an opt-in, right? So are you seeing the numbers you want?
Yeah, absolutely. I think almost everyone who qualifies participates. You do have a couple of people who maybe didn't see an email or didn't get an outreach call. And then when they have their associate review meeting, which we do once a year, and we say, hey, I see you haven't taken, haven't participated in the CPI program. They'll often say, like, what CPI program? I didn't even know there was a CPI program. So they miss an email or they don't follow up on a call. So it's really important for folks to know about the opportunity. Often if you've got a big practice group, you know, there are a lot of people, so people miss emails, etc. Hopefully not too often. But when they hear about it and they're aware of it, they can participate. And I was just sent a message by someone in my office that said, actually, it's not only African American and Latinx, but it's open to all diverse associates.
Hey, Dion, this is Sid. I appreciate what you're saying. I think at our firm, we've seen associates really embrace these kinds of sponsorship initiatives. I think where we've seen, at least historically in my experience, some friction is for our junior partners. And there's, at least on my side, there's been some challenge with accountability. You know, like we get a lateral partner in or somebody just promoted. And, you know, for the first couple of months, there's a lot of energy with him or her to try and integrate them, et cetera. But I think, you know, what we find over the course of, you know, that first year, second year, third year, et cetera, is that oftentimes that interest wanes for a lot of different reasons, but it's hard to keep both the sponsor and the sort of the mentee rather's feet to the fire. And I was curious to know, you know, how you guys have attacked that problem, if that is a problem.
I agree with that. I mean, that's with every initiative in any law firm, because there's just so many other things going on at the same time. So really, I mean, it comes, the tone gets set from the top all the way down, I find. So we've got a female chair of our firm, Jamie McKeon, and really the tone comes from her, and it goes down to the practice group leaders, and they sort of get held accountable to her. So everyone in the chain knows the importance and knows they have to stay on top of it. And then there's a reporting structure back so that people know these meetings are occurring, how often they're occurring, and often those sort of reports will, you know, filter all their way up to our chair of the firm, who will read them. So everyone is cognizant that they need to participate, and if they don't participate, you know, even the practice group leaders are going to get called out for not ensuring that the program is working. So I think the way to deal with that is have some accountability all the way up through the structure. If there's no accountability, so for example, if that group that I mentioned, mentors and sponsors, etc., they sort of get lazy, they don't push the associate to set up the next meeting, a couple of, you know, half a year goes by and no meeting was set up, people forget about it. So it's important that, you know, practice group leadership then says, you know, where are your reports on your particular CPI mentees? We haven't received them. So it's just sort of pushing people, herding cats with lawyers, and creating accountability that I think goes all the way up. I think that's the only way you can really ensure that people will do what they should be doing.
Well, I want to note that Kyle has joined us. We're so glad that you're here. Hi, and you probably guessed kind of where we are at the conversation, but want to kick it to you in terms of ensuring equal access to sponsorship, relationships, activities within the firm. How does your firm really ensure that that's happening?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me, first and foremost. You know, sponsorship, I think, is a really difficult issue, in part because it is, as far as I'm concerned, an absolute requirement for associates and young partners to thrive. I think having some kind of sponsorship, and by that, I guess I mean an ongoing relationship with a partner, senior partner, is really, really critical. So how do we do that? We have in place a mentorship program that we run, and it's really robust. So when an associate comes in, they are keyed into both another associate and a partner. And oftentimes we sort of purposefully make it so that at least one of them is not actually in the practice group, so that they can get a sense of what's happening at the firm sort of writ large, and then have somebody within the practice group who can help navigate some of the internal practice group politics. The other thing that we do, we have, of course, like the typical groups that are, the women's group and the various SIGs, and they're all pretty active, and all of them encourage interaction and actually passing out work to associates in an equitable way. And I think that's something that we've really committed to as a practice group, that when I'm thinking about staffing, I think about who's had opportunities and who needs opportunities. So we're really committed to developing each attorney. And some of that is a reflection of the business model. So good or bad, I've certainly seen firms that operate with the pyramid structure, where they bring in, huge summer associate classes, and just as a matter of course, the associates end up filtering out. And that's one business model, and that's a perfectly lovely business model. It can work really well, particularly if the firms that do that are placing those associates in-house, so they ultimately become a client. That is not how we do things here. We bring in only associates that we honestly think we can invest in and have a clear path to partnership. And so I think that helps. It makes the numbers a little bit more manageable. Again, there are upsides and downsides to that particular business model, but it definitely allows for us to be very thoughtful in hiring. And once associates are actually in the door, they have, through the mentor program, a form of sponsorship. And again, in terms of allocating work, associates are matched up with their interests and sort of what experiences they need to be effective in the practice group. And through that, they end up being necessarily sponsored and taken under the wing of a senior partner of some kind or another.
Yeah, no, and that's super interesting, Kyle. I think it's really good to mention different business models elicit different behavior, and people have to be mindful of that. Dion mentioned something, Keith, that I'd love to get your take, which is business development. And I will tell you that most associates, regardless of whether they're diverse or not, feel like they're always kind of behind the 8 ball on business development, and maybe they're not getting the insight into what it takes or the opportunities. How do you at your firm, Keith, ensure that business development, dollars and or time or however it's allocated, how are you ensuring that everybody's kind of getting equal access to that, knowing that that's available?
Yeah, thanks, Gina. And also I wanted to start by thanking Layla and Diversity Labs for the opportunity to speak today. And I would be remiss if I did not also acknowledge I am one of 2 heads of our practice group. So I have to thank my Nancy Skull, as well as the support that we get from our D&I group here at the firm, including our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Loie Duran, and Rena Ando, one of our partners, is very involved. We handle that, getting to your question, Gina, we handle that in a couple of ways. One is structural, and I think it's actually really important, is we do a lot of our budgeting up front. And so for big events and sponsorships and even smaller events, we encourage our attorneys to put as much forethought into what they want to do over the coming year. Part of that is in individual business plans and professional development plans that we ask our associates to prepare. But on an annual basis, and I know this right now because I just last week sent the email out to all of our attorneys, asking for events that they want to sponsor in 2023. So we start early in this process. But doing it up front allows us to be a little more thoughtful and mindful, and just having all of the data in front of us and the request in front of us makes it, I think, kind of a clearer, more transparent process. And so we're better able to track where some of those dollars are going. We can see where people may be maybe slipping through the cracks a little bit as well. So in addition to that, we do have a separate D&I budget that we use for other events. It's never a bright line because sometimes we get requests and there's a discussion about, well, does this fall on the D&I side or is this more of the practice group side? And our general rule of thumb is if the primary purpose is business development, then it goes in the practice group budget. And that's something that Nancy and I would ultimately sign off on. I guess some other aspects that we do, we have, I mentioned our D&I group. We meet with them regularly throughout the year. It's kind of built into the core of everything really that our practice group leaders do. There's some discussion in the prior topic on getting buy-off from and accountability. We have, as a practice group leader every year, I have to fill out a form, a self-evaluation. What have I done? And I've got 16 or 17 different items. And one of them is, what have we done to advance the firm's diversity and inclusion effort? And in fact, all of our partners, we have a similar survey that we have to, or compensation form that we have to complete. And that's one of the questions that all of our partners have to fill out as well. But we meet regularly with our D&I team. We talk about our associates, especially the ones that are getting up close to our partnership decision. So a lot of little extra attention that's put on them there, and share information, because sometimes they know stuff that we don't know, and sometimes we're able to provide a little bit of gloss similarly that they're not aware of. So collectively, it really takes an effort like that.
Sure, for sure. And Sid, at Reed Smith, how does it play out there, and how are you ensuring not only that you're really assessing all of the requests coming in, but that everybody's aware and has access to business development funds or however it's structured?
Sure. Before I start, I just want to say thank you for having me here. I just really appreciate the opportunity to actually learn from my fellow panelists here as well. So hopefully you folks can get something, some value out of what I mentioned, but I'm sure that you'll get some real value also out of my fellow panelists as well. So thank you there. It's a great question, and I think about this a lot. And I am actually at the firm for the corporate group in charge of approving every BD budget request for folks in our group. So it's a question and a sort of an issue that is really near and dear to my heart. I think the first thing that we try to do is just convince folks that they should be using this money, particularly diverse attorneys. And I mean, at the associate level and at the partner level, a lot of folks, and I was included when I was an associate here at Reed Smith, I think we just focus so much on being a great attorney that we forget about some of the other aspects of what business development can help us do in the future, i.e. autonomy in your practice when you're a little bit more senior. And, I think many of our diverse attorneys, irrespective of ethnicity or gender, et cetera, are the first to go to law school, in their families. And I think they put so much pressure on themselves just to be substantively excellent because they've had that pressure on them for so long that they forget that the law is, at a law firm in particular, is a business. And so the first thing that we try to do is get an appetite for them to actually, I don't want to say leverage their networks, but at least go out into the greater community, do community service if that's something that's interesting to them, be on a board, join organizations, go capitalize on what their personal interests are away from just, doing good work, which obviously needs to happen. But then I think what goes in tandem with that for us is letting folks know that we have zero expectation of ROI on a business development dollar that's spent. So folks should not be putting pressure on themselves if they take a lunch or they travel to San Francisco or they go to a conference or whatever. And within 2-3 months, we would expect some kind of billable matter. That's not the point, particularly for associates and fixed share partners like that. That's just not the point. The point is go and educate yourself. The point is to go and be comfortable in your own skin, create relationships. And those don't even need to be business generating relationships. They can be just network relationships, substantive relationships, et cetera. And just getting them to think that way and understanding that a business development dollar doesn't have to generate a bill. So that's the first thing. And that's a challenge. Honestly, it's a challenge. The second thing is I think our business development team, I give them a lot of credit. They work their tails off and they do a lot of data collection. And sometimes it's a pain in the butt because they're asking you for a lot of different inputs on the dollars you spend. They can track the receipts, et cetera. But ultimately what they're able to kick out is a spreadsheet periodically of where almost every dollar is going and what clients and prospects are those dollars being used for, and actually who's spending them. And so what we're able to do from that is to try and then evaluate who is not actually using BD money and why. And so, it's incumbent upon us as PGLs to engage with those people, both at the associate level, but honestly, more at the partner level to understand why they haven't used any money. And maybe the answer is, hey, just like Keith's firm, we have DE&I money as well. We have buckets there that people can draw from for BD, and maybe they're using those dollars instead of core practice group dollars. But ultimately, we use that data to try and ensure that folks are thinking about the business of law and not just sort of the substantive deployment of good legal skills. And we work with them to try and push them to go do certain things. At my prior firm, which I haven't been at a long time, they did something which we haven't done here, which I actually thought was really interesting. They had this initiative called 1+1+1. And every week you had to report one phone call, one email, and one lunch or drinks that you did with someone in your network. And it could have been a law school classmate, it could have been a client or whatever. And it was just to get people, particularly at the associate level, thinking about expanding your network, et cetera. And I always thought that was a pretty cool tool, and it really helped me refocus a little bit and learn about the business of law. But just going back to sort of the data, I think another thing our business development group, and I give them a lot of credit here, I deserve no credit here, does really well is that they mine. They educate themselves on everybody's practices, right? So it's one thing to say you're an M&A lawyer, but what does that really mean? Do you have an industry specialization? Are you working with specific clients? Is there more private equity? Is it more strategic? Is it more cross-border, et cetera? And they really get to know what everybody does, including at sort of the mid-level associate level and higher. And they are on the lookout for conferences, local or otherwise, for different other events that people can go to, and they push those to people, push them to partners, they push them to associates and say, hey, we think this is something that could really benefit you. You may want to go do this. And obviously, because they're the diverse attorneys in particular are in many ways underrepresented in some of these BD efforts historically, we try to push a lot of them to them as well. And that goes with the changing of the appetite point that I made at the outset. Those kind of work hand in hand to get people to start thinking about these things. But we've seen some modest success there in getting folks to change some behaviors and actually put themselves in positions that may not be very comfortable for them. Go to a conference where they're the only Reed Smith person there, and they have to talk to somebody. And we have the BD folks, and to a lesser extent, the PGLs follow up with them to say, hey, tell me about that experience, right? And really drive home that these are types of experiences and soft skills that will help them in the future. And I think the other thing I think we try to do, although again, what I will say is just given the way the corporate practice has really burgeoned, I think across firms in the last couple of years, I think what we've also tried to push people to do is understand, particularly diverse attorneys, you have both an external market, right? Like consumers of legal services at corporations, private equity funds, whatever. but you have an internal market too, right? You have partners that are generating work, et cetera, and don't overlook that as well, and try to think about how to develop those relationships, whether it's working out of a different office for a week, whether it's having the PGLs email some folks and say, hey, you know, this is somebody that you want to staff on the deal, or you want to pitch together on the deal. And then just one other point, we also are starting to, we're not great at this yet, just candidly, is we're trying to track who is included on a pitch, and who is, you know, who's actually talking to the clients, and try to marry some of the participation there from a BD perspective. But that's a work in progress, and maybe next year, if I get an opportunity to talk to you guys, I'll let you know how that goes.
Excellent. No, there's such good points, and along with your point that, you know, you really have to sometimes have people go out of their comfort zone. I think what I hear from a lot of you is also just making sure that everyone across the firm knows what opportunities are available to them, what the programs are and stuff, but also making them safe to utilize. You're not going to get dinged on your hours for this, or you're not going to be, you know, be a little more comfortable. I'm not going to be expected to have, you know, an immediate ROI, to your point, Sid. I think that kind of communication along with these programs would go a long way, but certainly also with BD flows to the client, and having client access, talking to, FaceTime with, working on actual matters. I mean, it's critical for any lawyer's development. Kyle, I'd love your thoughts on how does the firm really ensure that that is equitably distributed at the firm, that everybody is getting opportunities to have that client FaceTime in a meaningful way. I don't know if Kyle, are you there? Did we? Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry. Do you want to take that one in terms of client opportunities?
Sure. I mean, I think that some of it comes down to who are you including on your pitch team. So when you put together a team, it's just like staffing matters, thinking through, and of course clients are demanding this, which is great. But thinking through both subject matter expertise, who actually needs to have certain exposure, and then who's actually been on a pitch recently. I mean, learning the business development skills is absolutely critical to success at a law firm. I mean, at the end of the day, we all have to brand and market ourselves because it's a business. And I think that that's something that's really important for associates to understand almost day one, minute one, when they walk in the door. So, you know, again, it depends on the model that you're utilizing. You know, associates can come in and just be workhorses, but if you want to provide a path to partnership, which is the goal, of course, then doing so in the context of business development is really, really critical. So a couple of different things, both in terms of pitches, making sure that you have a team that's reflective of diversity in some way, shape, or form. But then also, I mean, I'm sure my colleagues on the line have this as well, where you get asked to write something or to speak on something. That happens all the time. And when that stuff comes in, obviously, I can't show up to speak at every single event that I'm asked to speak at. I'm not going to write every single time. And although these are quote unquote non-billables, they're really important in terms of branding and marketing yourself. So providing those opportunities in an equitable way and not just shooting it off to the very first person, but thinking through, you know, who hasn't had an opportunity, who needs this growth experience. And in the first instance, a lot of times I have a talk coming up pretty soon with a young associate that hasn't spoken yet. And I'm going to do it with her the first time. And then the next time I'm going to send her out to do it herself, you know? So it's kind of that model, and thinking about business development as a teachable skill, because I think that it is ultimately a teachable skill. Not everybody has the outgoing personality, and it doesn't necessarily come naturally, particularly not for the kinds of personalities I think that the law tends to attract. But everybody can do it. I think that it's entirely possible. So again, in terms of making sure that these opportunities are provided in a fair and equitable way, I think that it's being thoughtful and getting associates involved very early in their career.
Well, Dion, I'd love from that perspective, how do you take, the work that firms are doing, that clients are demanding for diverse pitch teams, and really turn that into something that is meaningful, right? It's not just window dressing. It's making sure that those lawyers are getting client access consistently, and are actually handling the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to our earlier discussion on sponsorship. I mean, it really requires a team of individuals to ensure that our associates are getting quality interactions that will actually lead to some meaningful relationship. It doesn't mean just because someone's diverse and maybe a client's diverse that they're automatically going to hit it off and they're going to immediately get work from that client. So, relationships are built over time, but it's important to provide the opportunities, monitor it, stay on top of it, make sure associates stay on top of it. To put also a slight spin on the client interaction part of the question, I think it's really any external interaction, even internal interactions with other partners, because everyone is ultimately a potential client, whether it's a patent prosecutor working with a foreign lawyer in a different country. When that associate is more senior, that foreign associate may send them work. It might be co-counsel on a litigation. It might be opposing counsel on a litigation that later sends you work because they like the way you handle something. So I think it's not just interaction with clients, existing clients, but it's really interaction across the board. So it's providing associates with meaningful, direct opportunities for interaction with all external parties, whether that's clients, potential clients, if you're doing some presentational brand building exercise, whether it's opposing counsel, whether it's co-counsel, whether it's foreign associates. So it's all of the above. And I think all the things we've been discussing today, all the things that we do to help promote D&I at a firm helps associates build the confidence that they need, helps them build the non-legal skill sets that they need, and provides the opportunity. So going back to your question of what can we do to ensure that there's meaningful opportunities, I think sponsorship really is number one, because it's not always, it's certainly not an associate's fault if they don't get in front of a client on a big litigation when there are 20 people working on the case. That's up to the partner or the sponsor to ensure that interaction happens. So I think it needs to start and be accountable at the level of the mentors and sponsorship that we discussed earlier. Of course, it's important to have client teams, pitch teams, etc., that have got a broad cross-section of people on the teams. Clients are demanding it, as Kyle mentioned earlier. All of that's incredibly important. How do you monitor it? It's a little bit more difficult. So what we try and do is for every single pitch that goes out, we've got whoever our head of marketing is for that group. When a pitch is going out, we'll ensure that the pitch is representative of a cross-section of people. We're not just going to have a whole bunch of white males on a pitch, on any pitch that we do. And that, I think, you can police by having, people like staff, like a marketing manager, keep an eye on that, and then report that to whoever the practice group leader is to say, hey, there's a pitch that's about to go out for something. The team looks awfully white and male, like we need to address this. And then if necessary, the practice group leader can step in and ensure that the pitch team is appropriately balanced. So I think all of those things I think will help associates have meaningful interactions. And so much of the training that law firms do is really about legal skills. There's so much that you learn by just sort of watching other people in an apprenticeship sort of way. And the more opportunities you provide for associates to participate, even if they're not talking, but going to a pitch, sitting in the room, watching other people. All of that really helps build those soft skills that historically, I think, diverse associates have not been given those opportunities.
Well, and I love the concept of, you know, building your brand both internally and externally. I think you all hit on that, and that's really crucial because your clients are in both places. And the themes that we've touched on have kind of more gone on the spectrum from, you know, really getting to be kind of seen in your firm and by your practice group leader, using business development dollars, getting client face time. But I think this next theme that you all have successfully shown the firms are good at is really critical and where the rubber meets the road. And that is, you know, how are origination and financial credit divvied up, and how are you ensuring that that is being done equitably? And Keith, maybe we can go to you on this one.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I had scribbled out a few notes, and on the top of my note, I put where the rubber meets the road.
Great minds.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start in part by saying maybe Shepherd is different, but to a great extent, this policing originations is not really a practice group leader role at our firm. We have a separate elected compensation committee made up of our equity partners, and they will interview every partner, every equity and every non-equity partner as part of the compensation process. There's an self-evaluation, which I mentioned in a prior response. And so at some level, you may look at it and say, well, practice group leaders don't really have a big role in this, but I think we do in a couple of ways. We have it on the what I would say the front end, and some of this ties into Dion's comments about making sure people have opportunities, and it's making sure that we've got diverse representation on our pitches, making sure that when we're staffing some of our institutional clients that we've got a diverse team of attorneys, and that people are this is where it gets a little tricky, that people are getting credit where credit is due. And then on the back end, even though I'm not as a practice group leader, I'm not on the compensation committee, the compensation committee does solicit input from every practice group leader. And we have an opportunity to provide written input as well as oral input directly to the committee, which we do on an annual basis. And so there are ways to influence it. You know, the numbers on the reports that our compensation committee gets, the numbers kind of speak for themselves, but we may be able to tell some of the stories that's not really apparent from the numbers. One other way, you know, the really difficult part at our firm, we have guidelines on sharing credit. And I should also mention that I think one thing that really helps that our firm does is we have a matter origination system. So credit is given for new matters, not on a client basis. And that I think that structurally that really helps as well. But part of the difficulty can be, especially if you're a new attorney or a new partner rather, is having those difficult discussions on sharing credit. I remember doing it my first time. I still don't look forward to them when they come up. They're not very fun conversations to have. But you know, coaching. As a practice group leader, I've provided some coaching to some of our junior partners, and I know we have what we call our non-equity partners, profit sharing partners, PSPs. We have a PSP Academy for our new partners, and that's some of those discussions. How do you have those conversations? How do you manage them so that everyone walks away feeling good about it? Those are some of the topics that are covered at that academy.
Sid, I'd love to get your take on that too, just in terms of how Reed Smith is ensuring fair allocation. And also, we talked a little bit about this, but we're talking in, you know, the sense of individual practice groups managing their business, but we know that work gets done on client teams often. So how does that then play out? when you're working across practice groups, but trying to look out for your team.
Yeah, it's a great question. We're very similar, actually, I think, to Keith's system. We have a origination credit as well on a matter by matter basis, in addition to having a client relationship lead, sort of the first to file, the person who brought in the client. And I think one of the things we're certainly not perfect, but one of the things I think that we do well to incent credit allocation sharing is that we don't let the person who's CRL double dip in the matter origination. So it's essentially a way for them to bring on other partners, other substantive experts, et cetera, and give them origination on a matter basis. And we end up double counting the dollars that come in, which is kind of interesting, but it seems to work for us in some manner. So our system implicitly is definitely different than probably every other panelist system here, but it gives us as PGL some flexibility to do a couple things as it relates to diverse attorneys. One, we look at us to make sure that those folks are also getting origination credit if they're participating in pitches or they're actually doing the work. And so, we're looking at the data periodically to make sure that tracks, because otherwise, my number one goal in my job is to retain my best people. And we're not doing, the firm a service in that regard if we're not actually trying to pair, particularly for diverse attorneys, their participation, however that might manifest in an engagement with, a pairing of origination credit. So that's number one. I think number two is staffing recommendations. I get probably 7, 8, 10 emails a day. Who do you recommend for this from a corporate transactional perspective? And oftentimes it's from folks, most of the time I should say, it's from folks who are not in my group because they are not sure who has the right expertise, et cetera. And for me, that's a real opportunity to put up diverse attorneys for these particular engagements. And it's a good way, because of our two-tiered system, to ensure that they're actually getting some origination credit on the matters as well, because they're participating in them. So that's one thing. That's something that I actually don't cede to my co-PGL. I like to do that because I'm the diverse attorney on the PGL slate there. The other thing is just teaching our client relationship leads, the folks who brought in the clients, teaching them about the way the metrics work and why they should be incenting their partners with origination credit and how that works and how that's not an issue at the end of the day for them from a comp perspective, because they're already getting all that revenue in the CRL column is important for us. And I think that we've seen a good trickle down effect to the diverse attorneys in particular, because there's a lot of absorption of diverse attorney utilization on our corporate matters, in particular for our large strategics. And so we're seeing them, year over year, getting additional credit that they absolutely deserve, which has been nice. The other thing I'd say is, we tell folks that they should ask for credit, right? I mean, Keith mentioned that these can be difficult conversations, and they are for sure, but you have to be comfortable having them. And that doesn't mean you have to be a jerk about it or be sharp elbowed, but you can be solutions oriented to think about what the participation looks like, who had relationships with the client, who might be doing the work, whose skill set is really the skill set that the client's relying on. All of that kind of goes into the mix here when you're having those conversations. And I think for those of you who are watching this panel, I think it's also what we've seen is clients are asking, who is getting the origination credit? Walk us through this, talk to us about it, and getting involved there as champions both for diverse attorneys and, frankly, just from an education perspective, to see how their law firms are doing it. And I'd implore you guys to continue doing that. But Gina, to your question, on a corporate transaction, as you noted, there's going to be corporate attorneys. We're going to have specialists, everything from the real estate folks to environmental to IP, et cetera. And I think one of the challenges we have as a corporate group right now is to make sure that some of the specialists who might not have been part of the pitch, unless it's like an industry where we need their particular subspecialty, we need to make sure as a firm that we're creating opportunities for them to get origination credit as well, because they're materially providing services to a deal. And there's some inherent tension of that against trying to advocate for my own people, right, and make sure their metrics are as strong as possible. I don't have great answers for you on that, other than I think what we're seeing, at least in the corporate realm, is the specialists are touching far more transactions than the corporate folks, right? There's only so many transactions as a corporate person you can do at a time, whereas an environmental specialist might be on 30 transactions at one time. And so what we're trying to do at least is carve out smaller pieces of origination credit for the specialists that over the course of 30 transactions can multiply into something more appreciable, and work on it that way. And so everybody, it's a little bit of sharing, and I think some folks really take origination, and I don't blame them for this, steadfastly to believe we should only be giving it to the folks who really had that client dialogue in the beginning. So it's a process for us, and I think it's evolving over time. But I think what we're trying to do is show folks that the ability to retain our talent, diverse and otherwise, frankly, is implicitly dependent on some origination metric. And so we as client relationship leads or matter originating folks should be in a position where we're sharing this appropriately and asking for it.
No, well, that's such helpful advice, and I think it's really interesting both your and Keith's comments about the matter focus, because there was a very interesting story recounted in the chat. Thank you for the person who did that, about a young lawyer going out and really trying to bring in business and the firm kind of not being supportive. This was a few years ago, and it sounds like things have changed, but there is often still that focus in many firms on the client relationship partner. That's the end all and be all of where the matter, if it weren't for them, nobody else gets credit. And I think it's interesting to see different approaches to how to allocate, and being thoughtful in that respect is really important. I'm mindful that we are a couple minutes out, and Layla, I certainly want to hear from you and your thoughts on all of this, having just lived and breathed data for so long. Any kind of key takeaways that you have that you want to highlight on these topics or others?
I think this was a really great conversation. We could probably have had a part 2 just with this group. So thank you all for sharing. I echo what you were saying, Gina, about the matter credit. It's so important, particularly as we see from American Lawyer reporting, more and more in-house legal departments are consolidating the firms that they work with, right? So that sort of edges out those, I think you called it CRL, Sid, or Reed Smith opportunities. So the more that we can share and expand the pie with underrepresented partners and lawyers coming up the ranks, the more equitable and inclusive this process will be. Thank you all so much for being here, for our panelists, for sharing this great, really sort of on the ground perspective of how you're using this particular role. I hope that others who joined were able to learn from that. If you're in-house, pay attention to these lawyers next time you need work in their space. And please do share these practices with the firms that you're working with if it's not these on this call. And Gina, thank you as always for moderating. We'll be back on Thursday for part 2 of this conversation with a different group of practice group leaders and some different topics. So hopefully if you join today, you're able to join then. Thank you all.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.